We're ready when you are.
Okay. Hi, this is Al Philreis. There's the sound in the room. We have some folks with us here at the Kelly Writers House in Philadelphia. We also have many people joining us by webcast, so we welcome everybody. The next hour and 10 minutes is going to be very informal. We have a group of people here who wish to celebrate the life and work of Sid Corman and honor it and talk informally about it from various points of view. We also have a room full of people. And we have people watching, as I say, by webcast, and we would invite them to, if you want to tweet us a question or comment, we're watching hashtag ModPoLive, ModPolive. Looks like Mod Olive Live. And if you're in the ModPo course, 35,000 of you, you can go into the discussion forums of ModPo, and Lily Applebaum has posted a little starter thread, and you can ask us a question or comment, make a comment. We'd be happy to hear that, and also from those of you in the room. So instead of doing formal introductions, I thought it might be good if the three people to my right, your left, introduce themselves by way of Sid Corman. Say who you are in relation to Sid, meaning what Sid Corman's poetry has meant to you, if you had a personal connection to Sid. And I would just like to say, in advance of Gregory Dunn's introduction of himself, since he came the furthest, he gets the one sort of super intro. He came from Japan via all kinds of stops. And we're just so glad. It was really Gregory's idea that we put together both this session, which is happening 4 o'clock Philadelphia time, and then at 6 p.m. Philadelphia time in 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours, we'll be gathering back. There'll be a podium here, and we're going to perform. Eight people will be performing each a Sid Corman poem, and then and speaking very briefly about that poem each. And we have here books, Home Test and Quiet Accomplishment, which is, and I'm holding it up for Zach to focus in on it, which is a memoir of Sid Corman. So Remembering Sid Corman is the subtitle. So why don't we start with Greg Dunn, since I just mentioned him, and say who you are in relation to Sid Corman, and we'll get started with our conversation.
Well, okay, thank you, and very much for that. Is that working okay?
Yeah, you can get closer if you want. You can bring it closer.
And I just want to say thank you to the Kelly Writers House for making this happen, bringing this to fruition. We've been talking about it for, I think, over a year, in fact, and maybe trying to figure out how we might do this. So it's real satisfying to bringing it off. And thank you again for bringing me over here and doing this. My relationship with Sid goes back to about 1986 when I met Sid Corman in Japan. Prior to that, I encountered Sid when I was in high school, taking a creative writing class, reading the great book, Hayden Carruth's book, The Voice That's Great Within Us. One of the very few books that Sid allowed his poetry to be anthologized in, because he had this thing about anthologies. And the way the story goes, not to go off too far, but he allowed his work to be anthologized because Hayden was a friend of his, and he asked that he would do it so long as he could bring in some other people, and like Larry Eigner and some other poets that he felt needed to be in the anthology, and Hayden Carruth acknowledged that and said okay, and so then Sid put his poems in. He just had some issue about anthology, but I'm glad that he allowed his poems to be in there. That's where I first really met Sid, was those poems in high school. And then I ended up in Japan by chance, and one day walked into his coffee shop, cake shop, ice cream shop. By chance, again, I was there. My friend was encouraging me in Kyoto. You've got to go in there. You're going to like this ice cream. And I said, I'm not in Japan to be eating American ice cream. I'm not going in. And then finally one day it was raining, and I just had to go somewhere. So I walked in, and I found out it was Sid's cake shop. And I'm looking at all these broadsides on the wall. And his a baker walked up to me, a Japanese baker in broken English, and said, "Do you know Sid?" I'm like, "Yeah, kind of, but I don't know him." He says, "Well, here's his phone number. You should call him. He'd like that." It's really strange. And it turns out that was Sid's brother-in-law. And I did call him up, and he really did say, "Yeah, it's great. Let's get together and talk." So that's how I met Sid. And I knew him for about 15 years until he passed away. And he passed away 10 years ago this year, So it's been 10 years. So this seems like a good time to kind of take a breath and think about his legacy and things like that.
How would you, I know it's hard to do, but how would you summarize, at least just by way of introduction, Sid's impact on you?
Well, I think it's pretty singular in a way, and I think it's not only poetry, but it's also the way he lived as an artist in poetry, and that meant a lot to me. And I think as a young person in Japan, after having attended University of Washington creative writing program, and I was pretty young at the time, and I really didn't meet too many poets that I could see myself, as a poet in that fashion. Some of the university poets, for example, who were good guys and everything, and I learned a lot from them, but they just, I just didn't connect with them in some way. So Sid was a guy who was that kind of an immediate mentor who just brought you in, sat you down, started talking to you, and so his impact was huge, and not only I think in poetics, but as I said, as a model of how you can actually live. And I argued against him in some of his ways. I mean, I don't accept everything about Sid, but still he was a great model, a great mentor.
Thank you. Thanks, and thanks again for coming. Tom Devaney, get us started about what's your connection to Sid? What impact has he had on you?
My connection to Sid is the poems that I didn't always love, but once I started to love them, I never stopped loving them. I knew Sid a little bit, but not enough, and then I met Fran Ryan through many different people, like Frank and others that knew Fran, and Fran had a long correspondence with Sid, and it was interesting. I always used to call him Sid Corman, but everyone here calls him Sid. There's this intimacy that people feel towards him, and Fran especially felt it because of the letters. But again, there's this integrity that Sid has that is impeccable, and his voice is startling and unforgettable. And there's just this precision that he has that's just the ambition to have such precision is just astounding. So there's this thing that I've heard here and there about Sid that one of the reasons that he's not as well known is that he was modest. And when you
he wasn't modest.
When you read his work, or there was something modest about his ambition or something, the ambition is as great as any poet I've ever come across to have the highest art that he could have. So he never stops giving.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah. Frank Sherlock, tell us about your connection to Sid Corman, his poetry, and his person.
Sure, I corresponded with Sid during the last decade of his life. His importance to me was, well, there are a number of things. One is his idea of coming back to him not being as famous as some other people is that he was such an advocate for other people's poetry, and poetry was poetry, and Sid had an ego, but he was just as easily pushing people that he thought were important or that could speak to you as a correspondent. And also there's the embracing of contradictions. Like over a decade of correspondence, there are some things that he would say, and then a month later the next aerogram comes contradicting that. And it was great that you could engage with Sid and say, well, you said in June that this and this and this. And Sid had a way of negotiating the contradictions. And like if you talk about Sid's aesthetic, it's this boiled down, precise thing. But his vision of poetry was so expansive and international, and getting into like his translation work and all these things, he really opened up the world of poetry and what my idea of what being a poet could be. And also as a young person, if you're going to do this, don't dabble, or if you're going to dabble, get out, because this is what matters.
So Sid is the opposite of a dabbler. What is that word? He's not a dabbler, but...
Well, I don't know if there is. I can't think of a word right now.
Yeah, neither can I, which is why I asked. I mean,
yeah.
I want to go another round and ask each of you to say something about what Sid represented and represents in the way of life work, the life of the poet. How did he lead the life of the poet? How can we describe that for people? Because it's, I think, pretty unusual what he did. Yeah. Greg, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I would just say, he was the commitment that he had, his level of commitment was really astounding. And even if you you argued with him or you hated him sometimes or however you felt about him, you never questioned his absolute commitment to poetry, and that to me was stunning. But he just felt that it was such a basic thing between human beings. It was a conversation that only, I wish I could quote the one poem, something like poetry becomes the conversation that we couldn't otherwise have. Something along those lines. That he really believed that the poem was a community. It brought people together. It unified two individuals, the reader, the writer, and he totally dedicated his life to it. I've never seen anyone else really do that to that extent in terms of integrity.
Tom, you want to take a crack at that?
Absolutely. The Sid's commitment to this precision that's been talked about is a fact, but he has this sense of the voice and the spoken and the oral and the ear that just so on the one hand studied and like exacting, and the other hand open and free. So when you talk about Sid, you want to just continuously point and quote him. So it just this whole conversation can just be us quoting Sid.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's hear some.
One thing that he called poetry that I love is he says poetry, the world as fully realized in speech. And there's these formulations that are kind of the distillation of a lifetime of reading and learning and living and being in the world and being in the voice and being in your body. So as an artist and as someone who's dedicated himself to the art, again, like Greg and Frank, as he lives his life, the emphatic commitment, almost in a pure sense, except he has that impure American bravado and pluck and grit in his voice that there's nothing pure about it. Again,
interesting.
The contradictions.
Yeah. Frank, what do you think about this question?
Sure. Well, Sid had this kind of monk-like approach to poetry, and it's almost like he took a vow of poverty to pursue this. And you would get the letters.
He sort of did, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it was a vow to. You have to vow to someone. But,
Right.
yeah, but I mean the letters. The streets are near, like month after month. But also, in that way of a monk being like the scribe and the translator and documenting. He would famously brag that he hadn't had a job since 1941, and he really expected you to do the same if you were, and if you weren't, you had to kind of explain yourself, which was interesting.
Lily, you have a mic, and I believe you have a question from someone watching the webcast.
Sure.
Do you want to pass it along or a comment?
Sure. Well, ideas about what the opposite of a dabbler might be.
Oh, good.
Carrie Oleskowitz says maybe lifestyler is an opposite
Lifestyler.
to dabbler, and Lexa Shalcross says maybe doer is opposite to dabbler. So I don't know if you want to take any of those and run with them, but a question that Yariv Paron asks is there a connection, maybe going off of what Frank said about monk-like commitment to poetry, is there a connection between Sid's poetry style and his decision to live in Japan?
Good question. Is there a connection between, let's put them in reverse, Sid's first going and then deciding to stay in Japan, and the style, the writing, the manner? Greg, you want to take a crack at that?
I think Sid would say that he ended up in Japan purely by chance, and that he tried to go to India, but he sent out
Took a wrong turn.
Yeah, he put out 27 job applicants, and he got one back, and it was from Japan, and that's how he ended up in Japan. Is what
In 1958, he got a job teaching in Kyoto, and he stayed till 1960. And then he came back, and from 1960 to 62, he and Shizumi, I believe, were in Boston. And then he went back and more or less stayed. Is that right?
I'm not sure the exact years that he...
No, then he came back again to Boston?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Eli Goldblatt supplying that footnote. But the point is, he was in Japan a long time.
Yes, and he dies in Japan, and I think over 40, 50 years in Japan. But I think I've asked him those questions about Japan, like whether, the influence of Japan, and he always kind of pushed back on that, and he would say that he didn't see his poems being that influenced by Japan.
And yet,
it's hard not to read it and see like Japanese poetry, and he translated a lot of classical Japanese poetry, but there were certain
he didn't know Japanese,
and he didn't know Japanese, but there were certain affinities, that for example, he liked to use syllabics when he wrote, but he would say he got that from Marianne Moore. And some people would look at him and say, "Oh, look at you, like Japanese, you're doing these haiku-like poems." And he would push back and say, "No, I don't pay any attention to those rules at all, and it has nothing to do with it." So I don't know what really. I think I've made up my own mind that he is pretty much influenced by it. And one clear example is his division of his books into 5 parts, which he took from the No dramas when he was going to see the No plays. And in Northeast Asian culture, 5 has a lot of significance. There's 5 elements, and it's before Buddhism, and so this number of 5 is a kind of completion and fullness. And so Sid, after getting in Japan, starts to divide all of his books up into 5 parts, and he'll say that clearly, that he did get that from Japanese culture.
Yeah. Just one of the poems from the selected, the next 1,000 years. Just following the mountain path, discovering just this violet, this seems to be very influenced by the poetry around him. Tom, Japan and Sid's style, do you want to pass or say something about that?
I think it's absolutely worth asking, and it just again shows Sid's great achievement in his poetry, because there are the hints of the Japanese tonality, and yet for all of his engagement with that poetry, it's such an American poetry to my ears and eyes. Maybe the eyes on the page are another thing, but the impact of the poetry has an American openness, and so the fact that you want to perhaps read it in that way, and there's poems that you can point to, like the one that you just did. There are these like little moments of directness and simplicity and surprise that are the sort of epitones of the haiku tradition and other sensibilities. But like Philip Whalen, who's more of a maximalist than Sid, who at least on the page is a minimalist, even though his heart is a maximalist heart, it's an American idiom from my reading of him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Frank?
Yeah, well, I don't know how much Sid would be intentionally influenced by Japan, but it seemed like Japan and Sid were a good fit in the sense that him translating Basho just makes sense. His poems have that kind of, although he wouldn't call himself a Buddhist, has that Zen presence and that pared down style. And so yeah, I don't know if Japan impacted him or they were just right for each other. But
was it exile? Was it in any sense an exile? I from what I understand, I would say yes, but it's very hard to tease out.
Yeah.
Greg, an exile of any kind?
Again, I think that is hard to tease out. He does go to France on a Fulbright scholarship and studies at the Sorbonne for a while. Then he goes from there to Italy and works in Italy for a while. All this before he comes to Japan. So I think he was really interested in the world, as he says, and he told me once that all cultures interest him, all people interest him. So I don't think he felt himself exiled in a real sense. Although when he came back to the United States, he didn't really feel very, very comfortable here, I think. I would just, and he had some instances with his wife actually breaking down literally in Boston, like coming home and finding her.
Yeah, the footnote I wanted to add, because Eli reminded us that he came back. It was 1980 to 82. They were back in Boston, and Shizumi did not. He may not have liked it either, but Shizumi, and that's his native area. Boston is his native area.
Native area. And I just go back to what Frank was saying. I think there was something very simpatico, I think, with Japan with him. He felt really, and I think particularly with poetry and the arts. Sid would write 1,000 poems, and he would talk about that, about being very productive and so on. And that is kind of like Japanese sensibility about poetry too. Like the great haiku people, they would just write poems, they'd hang them on a tree, and then walk off to the next village. It wasn't this idea. It was like, it's okay to write 1,000 poems. It's okay if some are not very good. Who cares? But the life, perfecting the life in art.
So any individual poem is not particularly gem-like worth it.
Yeah, I mean.
Right. So how do we just? This is not what poets that I know. That's not how they treat their poems mostly, and this is quite different.
Yeah.
How would you describe that? What kind of attitude is that to the poem?
And Sid had mentioned that he would put his poems away for a year in a desk and then come back to them and see if they. But also, I remember getting letters where Sid was saying that he wrote a book a day.
Yeah, a book
I
a
was
day.
like, come on,
That
this
was
guy's
his line.
crazy. But
Book a day.
The first of his 2 volumes of selected poems has 1,500 poems in it. This is the first of 2 volumes of selected poems, right? I mean, I teach Corman, interestingly, in the Dickinsonian tradition, which doesn't make a lot of sense until you think about the attitude toward the poem, right? Didn't he write poems in letters? I got poems in letters from Sid, and for all I knew, that was the only appearance of that poem, right? Yeah. Did you have that feeling?
Right, yeah.
So this is not, Tom, this is not the way we poets typically deal with their poems, no? Or yes?
It's one of those things, once you start to read Sid a lot, it's hard not to sort of start to talk a little like Sid too. He says, my life is in the work itself, and the work itself is the letters and the poems that he's enumerating, and for all of the number of those poems that you're mentioning, it's amazing just the tenacity that he wanted to get them all right too. It wasn't just tossing them off, even though he was relentless.
I want to get to specifically in a moment to the crucial issue of Sid's ability to mentor young poets and to encourage lots of other people and create communities of poets he cared about. So let's hold that. First, I want to get another comment or question from someone watching us by webcast. Lily?
This question's from Nathan Walker, and he wants to know what it was like to talk to Sid and receive letters from him, and how that relates to hearing him read poetry or reading his poetry not in immediate correspondence or proximity to him.
Well, Frank, you want to start? What was it like getting another one of those aerograms? What did it mean?
Well, you could count on when you sent out your letter to Sid, 2 weeks to the day, you got a return aerogram from Sid, and he would use up every inch of possible space to be typed on. So, and I imagined him taking this little piece of paper and spinning it, and he would type, and then he would run out of typing space, and there would be some handwritten notes. What it was like was this poetic history that's completely outside of the biographies I had written, or and at times it was gossip, but literary history often starts and sometimes finishes as gossip, but also these great stories about where Paul Blackburn lived and what troubles he had with his wife, and so I got invested in this idea of because Sid thought of the universe in that William Carlos Williams kind of way, is this constellation of poets, and all these stories about these people that I had only heard about or heard their names, and all of a sudden with these stories, and also you're sending Sid your poems, and he's saying, well, I think you might respond to so and so, or you should read John Taggart, or I don't like your poems, whatever, Or you should know, hey, there's this guy in Delaware who writes to me, Joe Massey.
Is that how you met Joe, through Sid?
Yeah, I met Joe through Sid. We started corresponding by way of Kyoto. So
I'm going to quote Joe before we turn to Greg or Tom on this. Just quote Joe Massey, who couldn't join us by webcast and couldn't be here, although he's now on the East Coast. He's in Massachusetts. Joe says, Sid was the prime exemplification of a life lived in and through and for poetry. As he said so often in his letters to me, don't stint. Sid didn't compromise. His poems were concentrated down to the syllable, and so was his life, and I feel blessed to have had and still to have his example. Above all, for me and for countless others, Sid Corman meant community, and as he put it, poetry becomes that conversation we could not otherwise have. Greg, what were the letters like?
Yeah, the letters were very immediate and striking in many ways, very poetic. I mean, it was. I would, in fact, in that book there, I actually quote some of the letters I received from him. And when you can, his writing was pithy and to the point, and he economized, but he made every syllable count. But they were hot. I mean, you get these letters when you read that, and boy, whew, it's just they're electric. And in a sense, you actually, how does it differ from his poetry? And it's interesting because really, having met him and sat with him, and then getting these letters from him, also, I would say there was very little difference. They were very. It was like sitting with Sid, and I think maybe that's why so many people have that real, connection with Sid. They feel like when they exchange these letters with them, there was an intimacy that somehow, really did happen, and unforgettably so for many people. And many people did communicate with him through correspondence.
I just want to. I didn't warn Zach and Chris I was going to do this, so we didn't hook up. But I will play. I'm going to. If you turn my mic up, I'm going to play a little taste of Sid's voice from my iPhone. So you guys ready for this? Okay. All right.
All right. It isn't for want of something to say, something to tell you, something you should know, but to detain you, keep you from going, feeling myself here as long as you are, as long as you are.
He's going to read another poem.
Will we ever understand we live for each other or we don't live at all? Alas, all the evidence says to this day the answer is an unrhetorical no.
What'd you hear there? What's the voice?
Well, the idea of living for each other, not living at all. For Sid, living for each other was the poem as connector, and it was through poetry that you lived for each other and you communicated to each other. And you mentioned Joseph Massey, and I probably can't think of another poet who is as faithful to the Sid aesthetic as well as the way to live as a poet as Joseph Massey. And interestingly, I had a connection with C.A. Conrad living in the same city via this mutual correspondence with Sid in Japan, and we would talk about our letters back and forth. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to read
this is C.A. Conrad.
C.A. Conrad's statement on Sid Corman. I had a long correspondence with Sid and bonded with me over this many years ago. Sid was generous, especially when you argued with him. Unlike many poets and other people with positions of authority today who are petty tyrants incapable of accepting criticism and lash out with passive aggression or artful acts of exclusion, Sid was a generation of inclusive, perceptible fighters. He gave me a new family of poets to read, making my lens on the world much broader and sharper. He exposed me to poets like Margaret Avison, Frank Samperi, Rocco Scodolaro, and many others, leaving me forever in his debt. I miss him.
So let's talk about Sid and creating communities of poets. There's an inbuilt contradiction here, apparent version of exile, and his the importance through his magazine Origin and other things of bringing the company, as Creeley would put it, together. And in those days, less so later. In fact, Sid started to do email, and he started to have lots of new connections. But for many, many years, because he was in Japan, it was difficult to edit. It was difficult to collaborate. In Origin, he published Creeley, Duncan, Eigner, Levertov, Bronk, Theodore Enslin, Charles Olson, Louis Zukowski, Carrie Snyder, Laurie Niedecker. Laurie Niedecker is a real support. A great supporter of Niedecker. Williams, Blackburn, Samperi. When he left, it was a little harder to do that. So for a guy, I guess I really don't know the answer to this question. For someone who felt it was so important to be a maker of communities and really a chooser of poets that mattered, when he left that, he really kind of chose isolation just at the moment when Origin was very powerful maker of that community. Can you figure that out? Was he too close to it? Was he not producing his own work enough? Anyone want to speculate? And if Eli has a speculation, we'll give him the mic. What do you think? Am I just pointing out something that's just merely incidental and biographical, or is there something psychological important about that move just at that time?
So you're saying that the Origin was just getting going when he picked up and he moved off and took it over to Japan?
I don't want to be too pointed,
Yeah.
and I don't want to make anything
Right.
psychobiographical about this, but
Right.
the exile meant in those days that it was much harder to do the Boston area thing.
Right.
Plus, he'd been on the radio,
Right.
The radio show was called This is Poetry on WMEX.
Right.
15-minute program.
Mhm.
Sid would just get on the air, and sometimes he would just read pages of Moby Dick.
Yeah.
Sometimes he would have he'd read Creeley and actually had Creeley do a reading in that. He brought Creeley in.
Right.
And sometimes he would just read Joyce.
Yeah.
Now, when he went to Japan, he lost that too. So he
Yeah.
lost a microphone, I would say.
Yeah.
How do you, am I making too much out of it?
I don't know an answer, like you're saying, to that question, except that I think maybe another way to go at it is another thing that strikes me is how important then Origin did become from even in Japan, those series. I think in a way, on the other side of that, then, as he told me, any communication he got was a lifeline. And he referred to like letters and correspondence as being lifelines. And maybe therefore even Origin became, like the third series and so on when he kept Origin going an awfully long time.
Yeah.
And some of the later series I think were I don't know when Frank Sam Perry began to get in there, but I think some of the later series were very strong as well. So I don't know. I don't know what impelled him to go off to France suddenly from, other than he got a Fulbright grant to do that. But I don't know why he went off and then over to Japan.
Yeah. So let's get that portable microphone and see if there's. We'll start with Eli, who must have something to say, and then we'll make sure that people in this room have a chance to say what they want to say, and then we'll keep going. Yeah. Hello, Eli.
Hi, everybody.
Is he on? Okay.
Is this on? This is a wonderful conversation, and I've just been nodding through this because I also had a correspondence with Sid, and Sid, once Sid accepted you in and began to make suggestions, he would do. I mean, you'd send him a poem and he'd tear it to pieces, or he'd say, "What do you need this line? What do you need this word for? What do you need? What's with this adjective?" He was merciless on adjectives, and wasn't too good on nouns, on verbs that he didn't think were doing any work. And I think so that if you wanted another word for dabbler, the other side of dabbler, it might be master, which I say in a very guarded way because I don't think he would accept the word, but he acted that way in the way that people take pottery and throw it out for the student comes and offers the pot and then you throw it away. I think that the question about
new
being
way of throwing pots.
The question about leaving America, and I don't have any secret knowledge here, but sometimes the most American way, the most way to be American is to leave the United States. And if you think about when he was coming up and what poetry was like in relation to the rest of the culture, it made sense in a certain way to be outside the United States and continue to be American.
Yeah.
And especially as a poet.
Yeah.
So I'll let this go to.
Yes, please. Yeah,
I
Greg.
was just going to say, I think that I think you make me think poetry. His translating of poetry, his interest in European poetries, I think really drove him out there more than any. I think it was so much an exile, but an absolute thirst and desire. He was very interested in the French and what they were doing, and then later on, Montale and all the Italians and so on. I think he was just pushed out eventually. That's why he left America.
Eli's referring to Kenneth Rexroth. Yeah. Each of us, when we think about Sid, we go to our shelves and we pick out poems and books, and we put stickies in our books. And so even though this evening at 6 we're going to be doing a performance of them, thought it might be good at this moment to hear a little of Sid's voice. Tom, you have a short one that you'd like to just read? You don't have to comment on it except to say why that one, Maybe less interpretation than impact.
Here's one called The Detail, and it's from a book called
And the word.
And the word.
And the word. The detail. If I don't do it, someone else must. The men pumping the muck out need it flushed to flow. Not the sweetest labor, but flavor of its own. The detail. If I don't do it, someone else must. The men pumping the muck out need it flushed to flow. Not the sweetest labor, but flavor of its own.
Wow. So it's his idea of work, in a way. And the work for him is poetry, so maybe another meta poem?
Yeah, and the whole world is in their filth and all, and there's no judgment at the end.
Yes, and then there's a great internal rhyme in there, as if to say, there's a certain amount of sweetness even here.
That's why I read it twice.
Yeah, I know. That's great. Thank you. Frank, you got a little Corman nugget?
Yeah, this is a sneak peek at the poem I'm going to read later.
Great.
It's from USW. Say that again. Before there was a future, all seemed promising, but now knows better. Who are we to die? Who are we to live? There is no end and there is no beginning. There's only always this.
Well, that hardly needs explanation. I like Sid's poems about mom. I have no idea. I only know from the poems about mom and dad. But he thinks about mom a lot, and I find it very moving. Why should I think of her now? But then she was my mother. She thought of me. This is pretty amazing. I mean, it's about who thinks who. And, of course, thinking of Sid means Sid exists. So why should I think of her now after all these years? Well, she thought of me. Why not? I don't know what that means, but it's very complicated.
All Sid poems are creation stories.
Yeah, all Sid poems are creation stories. Everybody should write that down. Greg, you got one for us? What book are you reading from? I have that one.
Nothing Doing, New Directions.
Can we parse the title? Nothing Doing.
Nothing Doing. And as Sid would really always tell you, it's got to be 2 lines. Nothing doing. That's Sid. If you want to have a 2-word thing, Sid in your back pocket, nothing doing is exactly right. And
perfect.
Yeah, I wish now that I'm thinking of that, I'd go for another one. But I'll just give you one here. I will tell you the secret. Listen. What is it? You ask. I keep telling you. Listen. That's that.
That's great. Thank you for that round. Lily, do we have something, question from someone watching on the webcast?
Yeah, this might be a departure a little bit from what we're talking about, but F. Omar Talon kind of wants Greg to revisit what he said. F. Period. Omar Talon.
Omar, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Perhaps Omar. When Greg said something about how Sid feels about anthologies, has a thing about them. Yeah. Just wondering if you could elaborate on what that means.
Yeah, I think he felt that it was never representative enough. It was just like 1 or 2 poems, and you really needed a sense of a greater sense of fullness. And usually the anthologizers didn't really want to give you that, and he felt that he needed maybe 10 poems or something in an anthology, not just 1. And so I think he was terrified of just 1 poem representing his work. And as you say, he has mother poems or poems about so many topics: fathers, mothers, family, poetics, art, and so be fossilized there or something.
And just on the anthology, Frank's word that Sid was an advocate, the fact that one of the chips that he plays to say, I'll be in it if you allow these other people to be in it. And his community.
Well, that was so classic. That was the move, right? To the support of young poets or other poets. So you want me, and you have to get the rest of us. Pretty good. Let me read Rob Fitterman's testimony that he wanted to pass along. From 1981 to 1986, I exchanged over 100 letters with Sid Corman. sometimes receiving 2 or 3 letters a week. Every corner of the traditional light blue aerogram would be filled with very specific responses to my short poems. There was also plenty to say about politics, other poets, publishing, life in Kyoto, etc. It was a tutorial for a young poet working largely alone in New York City and then on to Philadelphia. His care and comments about my work were enormously generous and formative. After a close and somewhat harsh reading of a few of my poems, for example, he then writes, "And yet in all of these, as I say, there is a feeling for language and a joy in it which draws me, and a sensibility. Out of this, there has to be poetry if you have the tenacity and desire for it," unquote.
Cool.
Another question from the audience here, or a comment? Let's go back to Ray Maxwell. Hello, Ray.
Hey. You all have mentioned your correspondence with Sid, and I think that's wonderful, but nobody writes letters anymore. So what is the impact of our sort of transfer to email have on this whole process, and how does that affect, sort of generating this community, this network of people who write poetry?
Well, I'll start off by saying that my correspondence with Sid was almost entirely by email. He was doing email at the end. And so I got a bunch of emails, and the only difference is that it was quicker, and I had to fire it back faster. I'm not sure if that sends your question in the wrong direction. But
Well, I can say this. I feel fortunate in being the last of a generation that still seeked out mentors in that way and had the access to write the letter and to be able to develop the correspondence, which is just by the technology markedly different. Coming back to the 2-word poems, in one of those aerograms, Sid had this poem that I had laughed about at the time, but it was internetting, inner nothing. So I remember talking with Fran Ryan saying...
Internetting, nothing.
Internetting, period, nothing, period. And I remember talking with Fran Ryan saying, oh, come on, that's crazy. Doesn't he know what's going on with the internet? But I think Sid really, when he saw this coming, he was experiencing a sense of loss of those lifelines that you mentioned, that his method of developing those lifelines and nurturing poets who were reaching out from all over the world had changed, and I don't know if he was hanging on to the dim hope that things might not change as they did, but I definitely felt that through the end of Sid's correspondence.
Tom, go ahead.
It's just interesting that I think that it's interesting that he seems to be a poet that's not of the contemporary in a lot of ways, and yet we're having this conversation. But even in his own day, though, Sid was had the radio show, so he used the technology of his own day. And I think he has a radio voice, by the way.
He does have a radio voice. So that show, This Is Poetry, in WMEX in the Boston area, starting in 1952, it was maybe the 3rd or 4th such poet-led radio program. There were some in the late 30s. But he was able, because it was still early enough, there wasn't a ton of consolidation, and it was local. He was able to do the radio show and do it the way he wanted to in 15 minutes. And that was cool and new, which is your point here. He was using, Ray, the technology of the radio in order to put the poetry out there.
But those letters, they're gorgeous, and the texture of them, and just the life. And
yeah. And is anybody collecting them? Fitterman has 100 aerograms. You have a bunch. And they're all unique, right? He didn't rewrite things typically in those letters. Eli, how many do you have?
I have to go up and count them, but I'll tell you who has a lot of letters is Gil Ott.
And Gil Ott, yeah.
Gil, I don't know that anybody corresponded with Sid more than Gil.
Yeah.
And all those letters are in the Penn Library, I think.
So there are hundreds of people in this room, and there are hundreds of people watching by webcast, and there are surely some enterprising editors out there, because Ott Corman selection of letters would be pretty spectacular.
Can I just respond to this? Because the question is a really interesting question, not just about internet. When I think he would have been a great email correspondent.
He was.
But I think it goes back to this anthology question too, because if you think about anthologies in the 50s and 60s, that, you know, lines were being drawn. You were either you were a real poet or you were on the outside. You know, there were the Lewis Simpsons of the world saying Allen Ginsberg's not really a poet.
The anthologizers.
And so anthologies were also a way of saying you can go on or you can't go on.
Right.
And that's part of it. It's a technological question, right? Who controls access to the larger audiences? Who controls? I mean, none of these people were teaching in universities, and one of the reasons that Sid, I mean, in other words, there was Charles Olson at Black Mountain, but that was hardly a university, and
it was quite a university. Hardly. It wasn't the University of Pennsylvania. There wasn't a football team.
They were walking around the fields looking up to see if the plane suggested that they were going to get any money. I mean, it was crazy. So I think when we look back on poets' lives, if we don't include that kind of the grittiness and complexity of the politics of the time,
then
we really can't understand all the things about where somebody lived and where they published and what they did. And I think Corman was really devoted to opening up lines that were closed to other places.
Yes.
And that's what Origin was, in many ways, that's what Origin was about. I mean, who else is going to publish Frank Samperi? I mean, it was like out there. Yeah. And
or Eigner at the time, maybe.
Or Eigner. I mean,
in the 50s?
Yeah. So it was, and I think that has a lot to do with who Sid Corman was. In that sense, he was similar to Pound in the way of being also an impresario, but at a in a less flamboyant way.
Can we get
we should get
Ron? Yeah, but Ron didn't ask to be asked a question, but I'm going to give the mic to Ron Silliman. And turn that camera around for ModPo people who are watching. You're going to encounter Ron Silliman in ModPo later, but here he is now. He really is here. Can I ask you a question? Because I know you have something to say, but I want to ask the question.
Sure, but I wanted to follow.
You're going to say.
I wanted to follow up what Tom was saying.
Yeah.
About the radio.
Well, you know, the way you
program.
answer my questions is to say whatever you want to say anyway.
Right.
So that's what's going to happen. Here's my question in case
spent enough time around politicians.
Oh, thanks a lot, Ron. Oh, you mean to be able to? Okay, yeah, that means you're running for Congress. All in favor of Ron Silliman to be our U.S. representative? Say aye.
No.
Anybody opposed?
No.
You're elected, pal. Listen, here's a question for you. So out on the West Coast, you're encountering lots and lots of poets. Was Corman among them? Were you aware of Origin? Because you guys your group.
First poetry reading I ever went to write a review of was at UC Berkeley at the Student Union, and it was Sid Corman. And I had been directed there by people I was corresponding with, like Robert Kelly, who had said, oh, you got to go hear this guy. So I went and did, and I wrote a review, and actually he wrote me a little note. And when I got to San Francisco State, this is like 1967, it was right after Robin Blazer had gone up to Canada, and he'd been the poetry buyer in the library for several years before that. So the rare books section at San Francisco State had all of Origin. So I read it all and started corresponding. So there clearly was a present. There were people who were doing things. I could find out about Frank Samperi. What I didn't know enough at the time was to ask why Macmillan, which had been such a Catholic, capital C, publisher of poetry in the 1940s,
capital C,
why they were not publishing like Samperi, who clearly was a Catholic poet, capital C, a decade later, why that had disappeared,
here's
why
another
that
version
militancy had risen up.
Yeah, here's another version of the question for you, Ron. So as you and your colleagues began to create a community of poets in a certain way, often around a magazine, the importance of that. I've heard you say many times, if you really want to get a community going, if you really want to get yourself into poetry, the best thing to do is to form a magazine and see what happens. Did Corman's example inspire you in any way? Was it a model for you?
It was certainly one of several models. I had questions about it from day one, because it seemed, with its high publication values and the difficulty of obtaining it physically, a little precious. I mean, the great way to get the magazine was to enter into a correspondence with Sid, and then he would actually send it to you. And that was a good motivation for corresponding with Sid Corman.
Did you want to?
But it was hard to come up with in any other way. You couldn't get it at Serendipity Books.
I think you said you wanted to respond to Tom.
I just wanted to sort of follow on what Tom said. I think, you know, if you look at like Creeley and Eigner, they all come into contact with Corman through the radio program. I mean, he really was changing boundaries and you know, and going on. In fact, I think both of them did essentially the same thing. They both went and told him that the people reading were not doing it properly. They were declaiming. They were being too much like Dylan Thomas and John Malcolm Brennan and not enough focusing on the text at hand.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Ron. Thanks very much. Does anybody know if any recordings of that radio program survive? I looked once and didn't find them. I wouldn't be surprised if Creeley, who recorded everything, including baseball games, on his reel-to-reel tape, if we look hard in the reels that were given to Penn Sound, we might actually hear from the radio, but I'm not sure, which is a loss, a real loss. Let's do one round of, since Sid loved gossip. He loved gossip. Let's do one round of gossip that's just Sid stories that can be told here. And you know, I have one, but I'm really, you know, and Tom's leaning back.
Yeah.
Frank, you got to have a Sid story. All right. While we're thinking of Sid stories, Lily, is there a quick question from the webcast watchers?
Yeah. Michael. Oops, I lost his name here. Michael Rush wants to know if the panelists can think of any poets working today who they think were strongly influenced by Corman's poetry or who apply themselves to a similar program, and you can include yourselves.
Well, we've already talked about Joe Massey.
There's quite a few people.
You want to name a few?
Well, Bob Arnold, I think, at Longhouse.
So Bob Arnold, Longhouse, is the executor of the Sid Corman estate and is a publisher of Sid. And it needs to be shouted out to, and I think Bob is going to see a recording of this. So any Sid Corman fans in the room have to put their hands together for Bob Arnold and all the work that he's done over the years. Who else?
I was just going to say, I do believe he's going to be bringing out of Volume 4 and 5 in 2015. He's editing
yes, he is.
That's
yeah, indeed.
Good news.
And I would add, not so much Frank Sherlock's line, but the way you read, Frank, there's some Sid in there somewhere, I think. I don't know when you heard his voice first because you were a correspondent, but sound right? You have a radio voice also.
All right, I'll take that.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was years and years ago that I had heard a recording of Sid from Fran Ryan. Fran Ryan had met him in D.C. briefly, and
yeah.
So but it was very rare to hear Sid. There were
very rare, very rare.
Few recordings.
All right, we're ready for some stories. We're probably gonna end on this. Any Sid stories?
Well, there's a story about Sid that he was writing this enormous book on Tchaikovsky, and that he stopped writing it. But he would. I don't know if anyone else knows if he ever showed it to anybody, but it was legend that he was writing this book.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that he didn't want to write about the Tchaikovsky anymore because of some things he found out. But then Tchaikovsky was the one that turned Sid on to Niedecker, and that's how their friendship got started.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
There are apparently some Sid Corman recordings at the University of Connecticut at stores that I have been in correspondence with the archivist about. They might be recordings made by Sid, or they might be Sid, and I'm going to have to investigate that. But
he made the only recording of Niedecker.
He made the only recording of Niedecker in 1970 when he went out to Wisconsin with his tape recorder. All right, are you ready for a story?
Yeah. I'll give you one story. At the end of Sid's life, he was, he's had issues with his heart, for example. His wife was trying to get him to go to the hospital and have it checked out for a long time. He just kept putting it off. The day before he was to go to the hospital, he went down this long hill and bought these 25-pound bags of dog biscuits and then he brought them up, one in each hand, up a mountain with his weak heart, and put him in the Genkan, the area of the living room there when you entranceway in the Japanese home. Put him up so that she would remember to feed the dog next door when he was going into the hospital. But as things turned out, the very morning that he was supposed to go in the hospital, he had a heart attack that morning and later passed away from that. But that's a kind of Sid story. It's a kind of, the other side of this guy who could be irascible and he could, be pretty demanding, but he's going to the hospital for his heart, and he's almost 80 years old, and he's going to go down the hill and get dog biscuits for this dog that's not even his dog.
Yeah,
So we had to throw him over and feed the dog, so just...
That's a great story. Frank, you got a Sid story?
Well, Sid was a connector for communities, but just as often you would hear about his fallings out. So the interesting thing is, would hear about all these poets that he had falling outs with, and he would never give up the details why. And I was always asking, but he wouldn't do that. But the one thing he said was that he was, in one of the letters, was that he was the most prolific poet in the history of the world.
Yes, he said that many times.
And then he would dare you to find somebody who was more prolific, which was an interesting turn because I didn't really know what Sid was sitting on. But the interesting thing about in terms of his mentorship, and then Rob Fitterman talks about the critiquing of the poems or tearing them apart. Even when that was happening, it ended up being kind of a positive thing because I would send him these poems and he would send back, just too jazzy, like in quotes, jazzy. But I would notice that like my favorite poets at the time, like Philip Whalen or Stephen Jonas, he would call them jazzy, too jazzy. Oh yeah, great poet, except for the jazzy one. So I got to take that as a compliment.
Yeah, indeed. Well, my Sid story has to do with the Writers' House. We began to do audio casts and webcasts in 1999, and they were pretty primitive in those days. But in 2001, we had a plan to bring Sid to Philadelphia, and Tom and Frank remember this because you were here that night. It was hard. He didn't feel like he could manage the traveling. It would cost a lot of money. It just didn't make sense, and so we arranged for Sid to read his poems from his living room in Kyoto over the phone, over the telephone. Okay, this is sort of a response to Ray's question about the internet and implicitly whether Sid would be on board. He agreed to that when we told him about the plan to bring his voice into this room by telephone, and then to send it out as an audio cast to the world. He really liked that idea, and he liked the idea that we could have a room. It was packed. There must have been about 50 or 60 people in here, and several of us asked him questions, and he read some poems. But there were hundreds of people out there listening by audio cast, including at least one person in Japan, which really was cool. And it was November of 2001 that we made the plan in April or May. By the time we got to early November 2001, we were still in the shadow of the experience of 9/11. We'd had some 9/11 related programs. Sid Corman made no mention of the attack on the World Trade Center and the whole gearing up to war business that was going on there and the fact of terror. But everybody in the room somehow felt that he was talking about that world, and it was electrifying, I thought. And the piece I played you just now through my iPhone is a piece of that recording, and Sid was coming in loud and clear, and I think for most of us that was the last time that we heard him. So one more round by way of conclusion. Throw out, let's hear some more Sid lines by way of concluding. I don't know if Frank has a book, but you can grab mine and pick one.
I transcribed some of that conversation from that, and I just wrote out the lines here so I could read that.
Fantastic. Yeah, you want to pick one?
So this is called Transcribing Sid, and all these lines come from the conversation.
Great.
We come out of a specific life, certain context. It has to be there. My life is in the work itself. It's all there every moment. Tenacity, grow and be you. Just feel them. If you can change one syllable and make it stronger, it's your poem. There is no God, the stupidity of war. There is no reason for anything. What the hell you here for? You are here to be. Patience, poverty, stimulating a lot of thinking. A question you raise for me. Criticism and poetry, essays, poets I care for. Feel what's there. Make sure every word is doing something relating to the other words. I never started a poem where I knew what I was going to say.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Tom, for so you listened to it and transcribed.
Yeah, and it wasn't just things he was saying, but Gil Loft's quoted in there. It's whoever was here. I mean, I think Joe Massey was involved with this, trying to get that program happening too, and he couldn't be here again. But.
Yeah, exactly. Greg, a few lines from Sid to end up with?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the first poem I read of Sid's, which was in the anthology, Hayden Cruz anthology, The Voice That's Great Within Us. It's, maybe people know this one. So, there are things to, and in one way or another, they will be said. But to whom tell the silences? With whom share them now? For a moment the sky is empty, and then there was a bird.
Frank?
Yeah.
I think this piece in some ways is a summation of Sid Corman's idea of the poetry-life connection, and it's called Blabbermouth. Everyone's got to know. Life is the secret we all want to, but can't keep.
Very cool. The tortoise. Always to want to go back, to correct an error, ease a guilt, see how a friend is doing. And yet one doesn't, except in memory, in dreams. The land remains desolate. Always the feeling is of terrible slowness overtaking haste. Okay, final words, real quick. Each of us say the last thing, the thing you want to leave an audience thinking about Sid Corman, and you didn't know that was coming, Greg, but let's hear it. Final words. Yeah. And by the way, thank you for making the trip.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here. I would say that what I'd like to say is that Sid has been called the best kept secret in American poetry, and there really is no reason for Sid to be a secret. There's so much out there, and the poetry is really giving. And so I just encourage people to find some of his work and look forward to those next 2 volumes coming out. And there's a whole world there. It's really unbelievable that his work is so little read by, I think, many younger MFA people and people in the academies and stuff, frankly.
Gregory Dunn, thank you very much. Tom, final word?
My favorite book title by Sid Corman is Words for Each Other. And to me that says so much about the community, the intimacy, the words. It's my favorite title, Words for Each Other.
Tom Devaney, thank you. Frank?
What I think we could all learn from Sid is his breadth and thirst for poetry, but also, and Greg, you touched on this a little bit with the giving, just the generosity of community and taking poetry serious. It's as serious as life and death. It was life and death for Sid.
Frank Sherlock, thank you. The last appearance in the United States by Sid Corman was in 2003. He was pretty tired and worn out. I guess the heart failure was sort of in the background there, but he made a trip, and it took a lot out of him, and he went to Wisconsin, which was a long way to go for him from Japan, and he attended the 2003 centennial event of the Wisconsinites of Southern Wisconsin honoring his friend Laureen Niedecker. And just that fact of the biography, which I wasn't there, so I'm sure there's people who were there who would say more about what it was like, the generosity, the self-sacrifice, the idea of hauling 2 bags of dog biscuits for the neighbor's dog on a day when he's going to the hospital to have his heart taken care of is exactly the wrong thing to do for himself. But he went there. He was such a supporter of Niedecker, and Niedecker's reputation is the responsibility ultimately of her amazing poetry and of lots of supporters and not just Sid, but he was major in it. And I like the idea that his last appearance in the U.S. was in Wisconsin to honor her centennial. We want to thank everybody for coming, Zach Gardner and Chris Martin for doing an amazing tech job. And Lily Applebaum and all the folks who sent in their questions, people who've come here. What's going to happen now, as soon as we conclude with one final round of applause for our panelists, is we're going to take a break for 50 minutes. And since we're doing a 6 o'clock show and some of the people who are in the 6 o'clock performance are here, we're just going to kind of hang out, and I don't know if we're going to call it a party, but we're going to hang out and have some fun, talk about Sid, maybe get some coffee or other stuff, and we'll see you again at 6 o'clock. Philadelphia time, 6 o'clock, where we'll have a performance of 8 poems by 8 different people, and each one describing briefly why they've selected that poem. So once again, let's thank our panelists, and thank you. That recording will be available in a few days. I don't think this group RSVP'd, but so we'll put the word out there as widely as we can.